All right, this evening we're going to be looking into the U.S. government, why it's here, what it does, and how it works, kind of. You have to forgive me, I'm a little sick, so you'll have to look over that. Now, the United States has not always been the United States. It started out as the 13 colonies, which were held by the United Kingdom, Great Britain at that time. Here you see those 13 colonies. Now, next slide, please. In the late 1700s, the United Kingdom started imposing taxes on the colonists for the 7 Years' War. Now, these taxes included the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, which the colonists did not like, and they did not get a say in, so they kind of started getting uneasy. Next slide, please. This culminated in 1773 with the Boston Tea Party, in which several individuals got on ships from the East India Company and threw an entire shipment of tea off the ship. This was not interpreted well by the government, and it continued to build tension between the colonists and Great Britain. Next slide, please. Closer to 1775, the colonists started to getting together and saying, we don't want taxation without representation. We want a say in the taxes that we pay, and that should be a reasonable request. Well, the United Kingdom wasn't having any of it, so they went to war. Next slide, please. The United States, which was at that time just the 13 colonies, in 1775 went to war with Great Britain, which was at that time the greatest empire on the face of the planet. Next slide, please. It didn't go well for them, though. They lost. Beginning with the battles of Lexington and Concord, they were defeated decisively at the Battle of Yorktown, and they surrendered, and the United States gained its independence. Next slide, please. So at this point, the founders of the country came together and said, well, now we're free, now we've got to have founding documents. So they start drafting a constitution. Many people don't know, but the Constitution was not the first governing document we had. The first one was the Articles of Confederation. But the Articles of Confederation gave way too much power to the states, did not give the federal government the power to tax, did not give the federal government the power to make a currency, and did not have a unified system of unified judicial system or a unified system of diplomacy. It was just kind of the 13 colonies going at it for each other in their own interest. This went on for 7 years, and at the end of those 7 years, they said this isn't working, came back together, and came up with the Constitution, which is the governing document we have today. This document was written in it was ratified in 1788, and this document established checks and balances between the federal government and the states, and the different branches of government inside of those states. It also gave the federal government the right to tax. It gave them the right to govern all diplomacy and govern trade across state borders. So it gave a whole lot more power to the federal government to be a federal government and have a unified voice for the entire country, while also giving rights to the states to give the states flexibility to make their own laws. Next slide, please. So now we move on to what the Constitution established. The Constitution of the United States establishes in its first 3 articles the legislative, executive, and judicial branch. Now, the legislative branch is the branch of Congress, which contains the House of Representatives and the Senate. The executive branch contains the President and all the cabinet members who are in charge of running the federal agencies. And the judicial branch contains the justices who are in charge of interpreting the law and defining what the law means and if they are congruent with what the Constitution says it should be. Next slide, please. Starting with the executive branch, here you see all of the cabinet secretaries. This just started with the President, the Vice President, the Secretary of State, and the Secretary of the Treasury. And over time, you can see all of these different departments have been added to deal with the growing size of the federal government. Next slide, please. And we come to the legislative branch. The legislative branch is the branch that drafts the laws. Now, it's consistent of 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. The House has 435 members, each representing the different population apportionment from each state. And the Senate has 2 members from each state. Now, there was a debate that was sparked when this was originally came up with, and they come up with the Connecticut Compromise because they didn't want states like California, who have 53 members of the House of Representatives, going up with states that like Vermont, who only have 1. They wanted fairness, so that's how they came up with the Senate. Vermont and California have the same say in the Senate, even though there is a big discrepancy between how big each of them are. Next slide. While we're on the executive branch, we'll look at how a bill becomes a law. So starting with the original bill, it goes to committee, the committee votes on it, it goes out of committee, back to the House votes on it, it goes to the Senate if it's approved, the Senate committees look at it, the Senate committee votes on it, the Senate, whole Senate, all 100 members vote on it. If it's approved there, it goes to the President for signing. If the President signs it, it immediately becomes law. If the President vetoes it, it goes back to the Senate where they have an ability to override it with 2/3 majority vote of the Senate. Next slide. And now finally, the judicial branch, the third branch of government, which is the court system. Now these are the 9 Supreme Court justices. There are currently only 8 because Antonin Scalia, the guy right here, passed away a few months back. So these guys here have the right, or have the job of interpreting the laws. Every law that Congress and the President put forward, they make sure it is congruent with the Constitution and make sure that it follows the nature of the law. Next slide, please. And here you'll see the United States court structure. All arrows, of course, go back up to the Supreme Court, but you will notice all of the layers, and that is a hallmark of the U.S. judicial system, that there are multiple layers. So if your case starts here, it can be appealed all the way up. So even though one ruling here may not necessarily go in your favor, you have the potential to have it overruled as you go up and appeal up the court system. Next slide. And here is kind of an indication of how the courts are subordinate. So you have your state courts here, which start with state district courts, come up to the state Supreme Courts, and go to the U.S. Supreme Court. Now this is on the state side. And on the federal side, you have U.S. district courts, U.S. Courts of Appeals, going back to the Supreme Court. So there is a big hierarchy of court systems which makes up the judicial system in the United States. Next slide. And finally, we get to elections. Now, the United States, of course, most offices are picked by direct popular vote. Now, this is true in most offices. Now, prior to, I believe, 1917, the United States Senate was appointed by state legislatures. The senators that we have were not actually elected. They were appointed by members of like the House and Senate and of House of Delegates down at the Capitol building. But now senators are elected due to a constitutional amendment. The president, however, is still not elected directly popularly. He's elected by the popular vote, the electoral vote. The electors come together on the second Tuesday in December and vote for the president. It usually goes according to the popular vote. Sometimes it doesn't. There's been 5 instances in our history where a president has the president has not won the popular vote, won the electoral vote, and went on to become president. It's happened 5 times. Now, one time it was decided by the House of Representatives in 1824. John Quincy Adams was running for president against Andrew Jackson and Henry Clay. Henry Clay was the Speaker of the House, and Andrew Jackson was the favorite amongst the people. Andrew Jackson won the popular vote. However, they did not obtain a sufficient majority in either house, so it went to the House of Representatives. And the House determined, due to Henry Clay's moving of the votes, that John Quincy Adams would become president. There again, you have these instances where it is kind of convoluted on how they come up with these results, but nevertheless, this is how our system works. All right, hope you learned something about how your government works. That's just the tip top of the iceberg, and it goes a whole lot deeper, and it would take me hours, but that's all we have for now.
Very good, Ron. Very good.
He said,
He
"Come
went
here,
over
Ron."